I'm going to be talking to Dr. Mark Winfield, who's a professor at York University, about an article he recently wrote about clean electricity. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Yeah, good afternoon, Markham. Yeah.
Look, let's start with an overview of your article, your op-ed. What's the argument?
Well, the article was triggered by Ontario Power Generation's announcement that it's going to partner with Hitachi to build a small modular reactor, 300 megawatts. It's not that small at Darlington, and very much portray this as a clean electricity response to climate change. And it seemed to me it raised two questions. One, which was what is going on in electricity in Ontario and what is OPG up to in terms of its own positioning. I mean, there's a series of questions around the announcement itself specifically in terms of what actually is being announced here. But it also seemed to me to beg a bigger set of questions which are now in play about what constitutes clean or emissions-free electricity. And more specifically in this case, does nuclear or small modular reactors fall into that category? And more broadly, I mean, do we have any way of having this conversation about what it is we're intending to transition towards, given, we have projections that we would need to triple or double electricity consumption and supply. These questions kind of move into the forefront as what then counts as clean or acceptable options in moving in those directions.
So in the Ontario context, the emphasis is on nuclear and gas. So if we look at gas and nuclear, and then we look at wind and solar, and maybe some other options like imported hydro or geothermal, from your point of view, what's clean, what's not clean, what's sort of clean?
Well, our challenge is that neither nuclear nor gas does very well in a definition of clean. To deal with them separately, the problems with nuclear is that it is, in a sense, the poster child for why you need to take a life cycle perspective on things. Because yes, at the point of generation, nuclear's relatively clean, assuming everything is going according to plan. And it is, even life cycle, relatively low carbon. The problem, of course, is in part what happens upstream and downstream, that you have very large impacts in terms of uranium mining, processing, fuel production upstream, which translates into some very, very long-lived impacts. I mean, these standards sort of figure on uranium mine tailings, which are radioactive and chemically toxic and acidic. Is you're looking at things that we need to be managed over time frames of 250,000 years or more. And then, of course, downstream, we have these unresolved problems around what do we do with the waste fuel. And now, nearly 50 years into large-scale nuclear operations in Canada, we still have no answer to that question. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is still telling us, we will have to come up with a management framework which will work over a period of 1 million years. And we don't seem to have that yet. So the implication, among other things, around nuclear is that it carries with it this risk of transferring significant costs and risks onto future generations, which would violate a basic sustainability principle. On top of all of that, there are the other complications, which are unique to this particular technology around security risks, accident risks. With the case of SMRs, there is also considerable discussion about fuel reprocessing, which creates a whole series of new problems of its own, both in terms of waste management, but also less relevant in a Canadian context, but internationally, raising questions about weapons proliferation as well.
So what about natural gas? I mean, Ontario looks like it's locking in its natural gas plants for the long term. There's no interest from the provincial government to phase them out in favor of something else. I guess that's a kind of a gimme when we're talking about not clean electricity.
Well, this again is problematic, and I have to say we actually did a sustainability assessment on the options available for Ontario. This was about a decade ago when we were going to the Energy Board on what was then the Integrated Power System Plan, and that hearing was never completed, and there has been no such hearing ever since. On natural gas, the concerns are obviously that you're burning fossil fuels, so there's greenhouse gases. With that also smog precursors, principally nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. And in Ontario, as we've discussed before, at the moment, we're looking at about a 600% increase in emissions from the natural gas side. The other problem on the gas side at this stage, of course, is that upstream, the sources are becoming less sustainable as we move from conventional to unconventional gas. We're dealing now more and more in fracked gas as opposed to conventionally recovered gas. And that itself, there are debates there about how much methane leakage is going on, what the actual greenhouse gas footprint looks like. Lots of concerns about groundwater contamination and other issues there. So the answer in a sustainability context is that neither is a very attractive option. And the implication is that the province should be thinking harder about its options going forward. There are obviously economic arguments along these lines as well, that the cost of nuclear refurbishment in Ontario is running, at least for Darlington, over 16 cents per kilowatt hour, which is very expensive. And as we've discussed before, on the natural gas side, there are questions both about increasing natural gas costs, but also discussions about, well, if the federal government is serious about a net neutral electricity grid by 2030, one of the obvious things it could do is to take natural gas fired generation out of the output-based pricing system for industrial emissions and apply the full federal carbon price to natural gas that's being burnt for electricity generation purposes.
Now, is it fair to say that wind and solar do constitute clean electricity?
I think on the other hand, yes, essentially. I mean, there are life cycle impacts, but because there is effectively no fuel cycle going on, you eliminate a large component of that. I mean, yes, there is some mining of metals and other components that has to happen as part of the initial capital investment, but what you don't have is the ongoing throughput, as you would have with the uranium fuel cycle from mining all the way through to the waste fuel, or with natural gas where you've got an extraction phase and then emissions happening at the point of conversion. So from those perspectives, solar and wind, for example, look very good. You could probably add geothermal to that list as well. I mean, their problems seem to be more in the realm of intermittency. And how do you manage that problem?
Right. So if I was going to sum up, Mark, would it be fair to say that wind and solar, geothermal are clean, and I guess we'll add sustainable in there. Natural gas, not so much, and nuclear has its own set of problems. And hydro, I guess we haven't talked about hydro, but then nobody's building any more hydro by the look of it.
For the time, well, we are building some hydro, obviously at Muskrat Falls and potentially at Site C if certain problems are resolved. Hydro is complicated. Smaller scale hydro is generally seen to have less impact. Existing hydro, one can argue that the environmental and social costs are largely sunk, and that it exists, and we might as well then look to optimize the use of those resources. In an Ontario context, there's a great deal of discussion about the relationship with Quebec because of its massive storage capacity. There has been some discussion of renewal of interest in new hydro in Ontario as well, although that's likely to be complicated and it's difficult to envision how anything would move forward without very strong partnerships with First Nations in Northern Ontario. And then the other option, which in Ontario is off the table, we should not forget, is on the demand side. That the province is operating at the moment with no effective demand side management strategy, either for natural gas or for electricity. And from a sustainability perspective, that would probably be the first place to start if we're looking to reduce the amount of gas we're going to find ourselves burning, having to think about the longer term role of nuclear, which is already in decline in Ontario because Pickering is going to have to close. That would be the starting point in a loading order if we were going to have a conversation about where do we go next.
Great, Mark. Thank you very much. Always appreciate your insights.
Great, thank you.